And to everyone who's joining from different areas, wherever you're at. Um, let's see, I'm trying to share screen here. And, one of the nice things that I think we've all come to appreciate about pandemic life is that at least this move to remote has meant that we have the possibility of reaching larger audiences and have friends and colleagues logging in from different areas. And so I especially want to say to my colleagues and friends from Mexico, saludos and gracias por venir. It's a pleasure to have you here. So I'm going to talk today about our recent work in the Tlajinga district of Teotihuacan. Someone please let me know if the slides aren't displaying properly. It should be on the first slide where you see a bird, a fragmented mural here. And I want to, talk, of course, about this new archaeological research that we've been conducting there for the last about 9 years in the Tlajinga district, but then also be zooming in and out from this particular district and particular households in the district to the level of the city, and then to a more comparative frame and actually start a little broader in terms of thinking of Teotihuacan as an urban place and how it compares to other cities, in both contemporary cities or historically. So I think probably the membership of this group knows Teotihuacan quite well, and many of you have probably been here. If you haven't, I'd highly recommend going. It's one of the jewels of archaeology or just human-built spaces in the world. So we get the name, of course, from the Mexica Aztecs, Teotihuacan, and it's a place, a Tolan, a great city, a Ur city that came before their own civilization, and a place that was seen as a site of origin of where the humble Nanahuatzin, a humble god, sacrificed himself for the good of humanity to start the fifth sun. He became the fifth sun of creation and started the cosmos in motion. So we see that in a few different codices depicted here. The Huamantla map and the Codex Borgia. Then on the bottom left, I love this image just because it is, of course, is one of the iconic masks or stone faces from Teotihuacan, from a site called Malinaltepec, south of Mexico City. But it's overlay with turquoise and spondylus shell that was done by Mexica or Mixtec artisans of the post-classic period, and it sort of shows the foundations, the classic period foundations for these later civilizations in a very visual way. So thinking broadly first, what makes Teotihuacan stand out among early cities of the world? Is it its big population, its large pyramids, its grid plan? No, it's actually none of those things. I mean, those are superlatives and interesting elements that we talk about for Teotihuacan, but there are, of course, many other sites in the world and in Mesoamerica with pyramids, Cholulas, of course, being larger than any at Teotihuacan. There are other cities that were on a grid plan. In fact, now we know a site in the Maya area, Nishum Chich, that Tim Pugh and Prue Rice have been working at. That's 500 BC. There's a grid plan in that particular Maya city. Historically and globally, we know of other gridded cities. Here's Alexandria in Egypt, the Greek model of gridded cities. So those things don't make Teotihuacan stand out, although the fact that there are large pyramids on a grid and a large population are all interesting elements of the city. But what really makes the city interesting, for me at least, is the fact that almost all its occupants lived in multifamily apartment compounds. And this is a situation that I believe is unknown in the pre-modern world outside of Teotihuacan, although I keep waiting for someone to say, oh, but remember this city here. I have yet to hear that, and I'd be interested if anyone can give a counterfactual to that claim. So here you're looking at Teotihuacan with Imperial Rome. The two cities were largely contemporaries, a few centuries BC or BCE, and then into about the mid first millennium of the Common Era. And here they are drawn to scale, so it gives you an indication of the large size of Teotihuacan. Its urban footprint was very much like Imperial Rome. So the population was lower, considerably lower, because of not as much multifamily housing as existed in Rome. Rome did have apartment complexes called insulae. These were multifamily apartments, and about a quarter of the population of the city lived in them, whereas for Teotihuacan, um, as far as we know, almost all the population lived in them. There could have been a smaller population that lived in more perishable houses that's yet to be well determined. But in general, so the masonry structures we see, folks were living in these multifamily apartment compounds, and they're different from the insulae. The insulae were renters; they were owned by wealthy individuals of the city, and so they were basically lower status houses, and especially if you lived in the upper stories, which were prone to fires and difficult to escape from. And so that's quite different than the apartment compounds at Teotihuacan, which, as you'll see in this presentation, I hope are relatively comfortable, even out on the periphery of the city. So, since this is a largely Washington-based audience, although I know the folks are tuning in from all over, I like to give an example of how Teotihuacan maps on to a city where the talk is happening. And in this case, this is a map of Washington where I've put east up, and so that the Street of the Dead and the monumental core of Teotihuacan can more or less align with the monumental core of Washington. And the two are of a very comparable size. So this gives you an idea, those of you who know DC well, like walking the city, what would the experience down on the ground be here? So where I'm going to talk about today, the Tlajinga district is, sort of if you were in the Foggy Bottom neighborhood, and then getting up to the Sun Pyramid, up the Street of the Dead would be like walking to the Capitol. And then if you went to sort of a northern district of the city, Otzoyahualco, where Linda Manzanilla has worked, that would be like the Atlas district of DC. So this gives you some idea of the urban expanse and how it maps onto. This is a map of 19th century Washington. So it's really these apartment compounds that have been interesting me for the last decade or so. There's quite a bit of range in the size of these compounds. They can range from much smaller ones of about 20 to much larger ones of about 200 inhabitants living in this shared domestic complex. And George Cogill calculated an average of about some 60 in sort of your mean or median Teotihuacan apartment compound. And based on the map by Renee Millen and colleagues, there's between 2,000 to 2,300 of these compounds around the city. So you can see how we can get to estimating population for a place like Teotihuacan, since it's a semi-arid landscape, and we can count how many of these compounds exist roughly, and then extrapolate populations from that. Both the work of the mapping project from the surface and some isolated excavations, and then larger scale excavations at many of these compounds show that the inhabitants shared craft specializations, they shared occupations. There are a high percentage of migrants really throughout the city, but certain areas are what we call ethnic enclaves, where there really seems to have been a close connection to the homelands, whether they're in Oaxaca or the Gulf Coast or West Mexico or somewhere else. So there is a multi-ethnicity to this city, and not just in the city as the whole, but when you dig down and look in any given neighborhood, you can see that. We can also see that there's variability in the status of the occupants of different compounds. As an example, and some of this is drawing on work of Mike Smith and colleagues from Arizona State, they would say that a low or intermediate status household, like on the drawing that you have, the plan view drawing on the right, that's a compound called Tlamimilolpa. That's one of the larger ones that could have housed close to 200 people, but they didn't have much living space per person compared to other parts of the city. So about 220 square meters of surface area for living space. Whereas others on the left, there's Tatitla, one of the compounds that you can visit as a tourist. more than double that, so 510 cubic meters. So that would be a more intermediate status families living in those multifamily units. Something that I've been doing recently with colleagues, Gary Feynman and Aurelio Lopez, is compiling some information on Mesoamerican cities, and we have a sample of 35 cities that have good data, like they've been systematically surveyed and mapped, and the population estimates are strong. And we've tried to add urban attributes, natural ecological attributes, to look at a few different correlations between this sample cities. And this spans the pre-classic to the post-classic. So there's Olmec to Aztec cities in this particular sample. Here you're looking at just some correlations based on population density. So actually, the strongest indicator of density is absolute population size. So larger cities in Mesoamerica also tended to be denser, is one strong correlation that we have. But here what I'm mapping is on the left housing type. And so we just used ordinal coding of housing type. Isolated houses, number one, patio groups, number two, what are called house compounds, like you see in places like Tula, is number three, and then apartment compounds is number four. Teotihuacan stands out as being the only place where that was the dominant mode of housing. Tula also had apartment compounds, but that wasn't the main form of housing. And you can see that as sites get denser, there's a tendency to have more agglutinative, stuck together rooms, compound-like living in those particular houses. None of the cities in our sample, it should be noted, was isolated housing a dominant model. That obviously would be a more rural pattern. Another thing we looked at was we had coded different indices of collectivity, like what seems to be wealth inequalities, what's the political economy, the underpinnings based on more prestige goods versus more utilitarian goods, how visible are rulers, how much is the focus on god kings, divine kingship versus more abstract notions of power. And based on that coding that we came up with, we also see that denser cities tend to be more collective as well. So there's a correlation between those. So that gives us some indications of where these things came from and how they map onto the socio-political organization of Teotihuacan. But we also, if we go back a little further before Teotihuacan into the formative period, another period I've also worked on more in the state of Tlaxcala, is that we can see some of the antecedents to the Teotihuacan apartment compound in the domestic architecture of central Mexico from that period. And in particular, we can see compound type houses like orthogonal added room blocks in certain places in the basin of Mexico, like Cuicuilco, like Loma Terremote. And then we can also see the patio group orientation that a site like Tetimpa has, where Patricia Plunkett and Gabriela Uruñuela worked for years, uncovered over 20 of these patio groups, and very well preserved from the volcanic eruption of Popocatépetl. And that gives us the central sort of organizing patio space, domestic space, shared domestic space that you see in the heart of the Teotihuacan apartment compounds. And so, what I think we really see here is something that the urban theorist Spiro Kostoff talked about, a model of spatial replication, where in Teotihuacan, there is no big town plaza like was the dominant model in central Mexico and places like Tenochtitlan and Tula. Rather, you have this elongated street of the dead, but you have that as the anchor of the city. And then you have districts with their own district centers, or also called barrio centers, with apartment compounds organized around those. And then you look at any given apartment compound, and it's these central courtyards with the room blocks around them. And so that's a model of replication that Kostoff talks about. So when we go from the scale of the city down to districts and neighborhoods, we have some previous work by Mexican colleagues, particularly in the La Ventilla district by Ruben Cabrera and Sergio Gomez and others, and then in Teopan Casco, you can see the arrows in the southwest and southeast of the city that Linda Manzanilla and team has been working at. And then down further to the south, where that number 14 is, you have the Tlajinga district where we've been working. So we draw in large part on some of these previous projects for the organization of district and neighborhood space, having barrio centers and how other aspects of domestic life were organized from these other projects, which we can compare Tlajinga with. Another element of the project, of course, is that Teotihuacan is an ancient city on the urban periphery of one of the largest modern cities of the world. And so, because of that, as Mexico City has been growing, and this map you can see ends at 2000, and there's been another 20 years of urbanization through in the basin of Mexico. The landscape and the zone have modern occupation encroaching on it, and that's part of the reality of working in a place like Tlajinga, which is outside of the protected, fenced-in zone of the tourist zone of Teotihuacan, where most folks visit. And so, we're also concerned with that and trying to preserve the site and trying to work with the community as much as possible to understand the importance of this place and its significance to future generations and in studying world cities as a whole. Other aspects of that, so probably some of you are familiar with the coverage the New York Times gave of when Walmart put a subsidiary box store called Bodegas Aurrera in part of the southwestern portion of the site over apartment compounds, over a different district from where we work. You can see on the bottom map where Tlajinga is in relation to that store. But then more recent looting in that Otzoyawalco neighborhood that I talked about, where I shouldn't say looting, illegal construction, where a landowner was bulldozing remains to build something. And so some of these sites are endangered, and understanding the neighborhood organization and household organization at Teotihuacan is part of staying on top of it and working with communities on the periphery. So here then is the project, and this is a project that I have different collaborators with, including on the top left, you can see Luis Barba and Agustin Ortiz and others from UNAM's prospection laboratory. They do remote sensing techniques and different archaeological science techniques. I've also worked with Ken Hirth at Penn State and many of his students, some of whom are depicted in these slides. And of course, there was a previous project in Tlajinga run through Penn State and directed, by Bill Sanders, but the real field directors were Rebecca Story and Dolph Widmer, who excavated a very large portion of one compound at Tlajinga, 33 South 3 West 1, or known as Tlajinga 33. And they showed that this was a community of potters that were making utilitarian ware called San Martin orange, which doesn't look particularly impressive, but they'd make really large pots, very functional pots, and you have some of the production tools in that slide on top. And Rebecca worked with the mortuary remains and continues to do so for our project, and Dolph is involved also, particularly with lapidary remains. So we did for 2 initial seasons that were looking at house compounds or apartment compounds, and you can see on these slides how distant the pyramids look. They're a couple miles away, or something like 3 kilometers away from the pyramids, and so even these massive things seem to be dwarfed by that distance. But you can see Cerro Gordo, the largest hill in the landscape due north, and these different compounds and parts of the extension, the southern extension of the Street of the Dead, where we excavated. So here's a map that we did using a drone, and this Guillermo Acosta actually and team did this particular drone map, and areas that we excavated, and we've overlaid the Millen map on top of it, so you can see where the prolongation of the Street of the Dead to the south is. Some areas that were mound clusters that were higher. This particular compound that we excavated at 17 is a larger one. It's 100 meters on a side, so that's a bigger apartment compound. Ken Hirth and I were particularly interested in this area because it was super dense obsidian, and that's an economy that's interested both of us in looking at domestic production that I'll get to in a second. And then another compound just to the north, 18, where we excavated a few different blocks, but we're sort of in the center of the compound here, and looking at the courtyard area, and then cuts into the Street of the Dead to confirm that this was an area that was not natural. It was an anthropogenic landscape. Humans cut down in tepetate, which is the volcanic tuff substrate of central Mexico, and they lowered it a meter with some 40 meters on a side and for at least a couple kilometers. So this was a massive landscape renovation project that we see to the south here to extend that central axis further south from the center of the site. When we dug deep in a few areas where we could, where there wouldn't be later architecture to disrupt, we see a sequence of floors and we see an earlier pre-apartment compound occupation. So if you look at that image on the left, you can see a crushed tepetate, that's that volcanic tuft floor that's just been sort of crushed down and made flat, and you see post holes into it. And we have multiple occupation surfaces coming up from there. If you look in the image on the right, you might be able to make some adobe bricks out on the top right. That's when you start having apartment compounds. So what we're dealing with was a more rural landscape in Tlajinga in the early city's history, with wattle and daub type constructions like you would see here, making way for urbanization and more people filling in the landscape and creating apartments like this. And we have close to, I think, 30 radiocarbon dates. So this particular sequence and the transition to apartment living is well documented, and you can see dates going roughly from about 200 to 550 AD. There's an outlier, there's an intrusive later burial that you see at the top over there. Also, when we dig down, one thing that we see are hearths, and that's interesting because Teotihuacan apartment compounds don't have hearths. And so these fire features, like that are usually rectangular or square, we have actually, you can see in the microstratigraphy, evidence of in situ burning, the ash, the charcoal that you see over here. And what happens is as people start living in these denser apartment compounds, they adapt to not like having billowing smoke going in the rooms and into their neighbors' rooms, to probably cooking largely, most of the cooking is happening outdoors, and then reheating is happening in these stone anafres or stoves that you see made out of ceramic on the top. So archaeologists are always prone to corny puns, and I'm no exception here. So, all archaeologists can say that we do groundbreaking research as part of our excavations, but only people who study lithics also are doing cutting edge research. And here you see Ken Hirth and team on the top right from Penn State organizing in excruciating detail all this tiny little debitage that we have from this obsidian production area in one of these compounds, compound 17. And you're just getting a sense of the amount of cores that we found and the debitage, the waste byproducts that was drying just from one day of excavations from this workshop context. So here the folks who lived in 17 were obsidian workers, was one of their main trades. And they not only produced lots of it and left us their garbage, which was helpful for reconstructing that economy, but they also offered it to the house, like in offerings of consecration or dedication. And you can see some of those here where these nuclei of for obsidian blades were deposited with shell or with ceramics and other materials like that. And when we did a post-hole sampling, taking one of those post excavating tools and just systematically charting out, I don't know how many meters, maybe every 5 meters or so, and then registering how much debitage was in, say, a liter. Then we get counts of obsidian, and you can see where we excavated in those rectangles over here. We're actually somewhat north of the densest deposit, which was farther to the south. So this was really a massive domestic obsidian workers compound, one of the largest in the city. There's another to the northeast that saw a salvage project that to me seems actually even larger than this one, if you can believe it. But we were interested when we looked at the surface in this one in particular because it seemed really focused on obsidian blades, and it was nice and easy to get at that key industry for classic period Mesoamerica. So we see that people were making, like on the top left, obsidian blades, and they left us some of the cores. And you can see the example on the right is beautifully done. in now 20 years of napping Obsidian myself to try to understand the processes and experimentation. I've never reached that level. This is someone who is a skilled artisan. But the one on the left looks a little more my style. I could probably make a core like that, no problem. This is somebody who is starting out, someone who is intermediate. And one thing that we noticed is the platforms on these cores are expertly done. So probably a master napper was popping off the platforms and then handing it to apprentices who are then removing blades and doing so at different levels. Likewise, there are a few dart points that we have, and you can see on bottom left, and we have this spectrum of a beautifully rendered one to the right to a real beginner. So we think we have good evidence of apprenticeship within Compound 17, and the fact that this was a family trade that was passed on through generations. I came across a fascinating reference like a year or so ago that in Nahuatl there's a term for kindred or the children of a family that in some ways it's analogous to the English chip off the old block, but it's like an obsidian flake off the core. So it's like this idea that the kids are the next generation, they're the flakes, and here this would be doubly true for this particular family. We also have offerings like this one with shell, and of course shell is non-local. We're up in the mountains, 2,300 meters above sea level, and but here we see that there are exchange routes coming to Tlajinga that were procuring shell from the Gulf of Mexico and Pacific in almost equal proportions. We also dug at this compound 18. This is here, we're in the center of the compound, rather off to the side where we dug in 17 because of the obsidian. And so here we're dealing with courtyards and rooms and offerings associated with them. And here the most notable deposit for sure was one of these stone faces, like you saw in one of those early slides, that Malinaltepec mask. Now here's a classic Teotihuacan face or mask carved out of a stone. It's a form of limestone, and this was part of what we think was a termination deposit. And why is that? You can see within this courtyard, all of these large vessels had been smashed, and so here's just a reconstruction of some of these vessels. They're San Martin orange, like the folks at Tlajinga 33 were making, but you can see these very large pieces of these pots had been smashed on this floor. So once this is right on the floor level. If you look on the top of this image, you can see some of the plaster smoothers and manos and metates and other domestic remains here too. So this was like this is the sort of offering that, especially since it's right at the abandonment of the compound, that you'd expect associated with a termination ritual. So from looking at these domestic contexts, we can say that first we have evidence of the development of apartment compounds in an earlier, more rural setting. So we can say that Teotihuacan wasn't always apartment living. There was a time where there were more rural areas out on the periphery where folks were farming and on the outskirts of the city, and that slowly through sprawl, through processes of urban sprawl, became urbanized and part of the city. The city's urban core and had apartment living. We also see that there's intensive utilitarian production of different goods, not just obsidian. We also have extensive lapidary production and a few other craft industries. And this is way out from the city center. So the earlier models were about Teotihuacan monopolizing everything in this very monolithic top-down state. Those can now really be discarded. There's just abundant evidence of different ways of producing for a more commercialized economy. Now, there's some instances where, yes, the state got involved in production that I'm happy to talk about later. That was part of my dissertation work in the Moon Pyramid, is looking at such a case of obsidian. But here out on the periphery, we can see that there's, these folks who should be some of the lowest socioeconomic status of the city had access to resources like these stone faces, like polychrome pottery, like marine shell, that speaks to a higher standard of living for this particular city. That this is the urban periphery, and folks were pretty plugged into a commercialized economy. So next in our work, we turned to looking at public district or neighborhood spaces. So this complex on the map by Millen are what we would call the neighborhood center or barrio center for Tlajinga, and we subdivide it into sort of a northern and southern. So to the north, you see this these mounds of group seven, and then to the south, you see these what look like they're mapped as sort of flat compounds. But if you look at the topography, you can really see those stand out. Those are some of the tallest things. In fact, four is the tallest thing in Tlajinga. And so we were interested in that. And what is this big compound that's so elevated and seems prominent compared to the others? And so we started excavating in the southern neighborhood center. Now, one way of thinking about neighborhood centers in Teotihuacan and other parts of Mesoamerica are places of social infrastructure. And this is a term that I'm taking from being inspired by work by urban theorists. One of them is Eric Kleinenberg. He's a sociologist at NYU. And he named he titled this book Palaces for the People based on something that Carnegie said as he was building libraries for different communities. So, today in the United States, of course, we're having lots of discussions about what is infrastructure. So, what is the infrastructure package that everybody can agree on? Now, that's ones that people would consider hard infrastructure. So, like urban theorists would talk about hard infrastructure, roads, bridges, drain networks, transportation. That's the hard infrastructure. If anyone gets to New Yorker, Kleinenberg actually had an article a couple weeks ago that was looking at what people are calling green infrastructure, and this is things like to mitigate against sea surges in New York. They're planting oyster beds, which can help to mitigate these rushes of water. And so thinking about infrastructure as one that makes cities greener and more connected with the natural world, and that can help us mitigate climate change. Social infrastructure are those spaces where people get together and generally enjoy themselves. So they're public spaces, open to communities and neighborhoods or in city centers, where people like parks and libraries and other facilities like that are part of the social infrastructure. And some of that is where our contemporary political debates are at. Like, are we just funding hard infrastructure, or are we going to also invest in green infrastructure and social infrastructure? So we can look at places like Teotihuacan to see what benefits come out of investing in social infrastructure. And so going back to that comparative sample that we're looking at, we can see that those cities that have more social infrastructure also tend to be more collective. There tends to be more pluralistic decision making. One of Kleinenberg's cases comes out of Chicago, where there was a heat wave and many people died in the city, and he was leveling for socioeconomic status and looking at, so why did this neighborhood fare well and that one didn't? And one of the keys he came to was with social infrastructure, that there are things where people get together and that makes them check in on each other when there's a time of crisis, and it makes more resilient communities. And so that's something that I think we can think about in terms of past contexts like Teotihuacan. So then thinking about Tlajinga's neighborhood center, here you see a drone shot of some work in progress with the UNAM team doing some ground penetrating radar, and you can see our excavations over to the right and over on top by those electric towers. You can see that this a railroad cuts right through this particular part of the site, and we still have, this is one of the main lines that connects Veracruz into Mexico City. So we then have, because of that railroad, it bifurcated one of these mounds, and it gives us a strange topographic layout. But we had two intact mounds, and so we put excavations on both of those. And the one that we excavated most extensively is called Complex 4. And here you can see different patios, structures, different types of architecture. This adobe architecture that you see in brown on this particular plan view image, it wasn't actually final walls. These were the walls that went in between the substructure or the penultimate structure and the last structure, and they were just to raise the floor level. So there were what's known in Mexico as cajon relleno, box and fill way of growing the particular structure and the living surface. So, associated with excavations here, we found a number of different offerings, and they tell us of a structure that's different from a normal apartment compound. First of all, if you look down on the bottom left where it says structure 4B, there's talud tablero stucco covered architecture. Now, I probably didn't highlight this in the earlier slides, but when we excavated at those apartment compounds, 17 and 18, and what Dolph and Rebecca know from Tlajinga 33, there's very little stucco and there's very little fine masonry like this, and there sure is no mural painting. But so we're seeing different things here at Complex 4, where there's talud tablero facades, mural painting, and different sorts of materials. So there are cache deposits of ceramics. There's this feature 44, which is this looks to be this box, this clay cemented box that had a lot of spondylus shell, which comes, is quite a prestigious item coming from the Pacific coast. It had magnetite beads that you see on the top and some pyrite beads. So these different iron ores that are also coming from a distance, maybe Oaxaca. We haven't sourced those yet, but those are places that have those particular iron ores. And then in the center, in the courtyard, we have part of a old god of fire brazier known as Huehueteot to the Aztecs and Nahuatl, and parts of composite sensors. So this seems to have been a ritual space. It seems to be a different use. It's not a regular apartment compound like those we had excavated so far. What we think we probably have is a plan of these two buildings that we've excavated, and then we could extrapolate there'd be a third there. There's not enough space to the north for a closing one. So we're dealing with a courtyard group with three structures like this, and the remains of some altar, probably where that old god of fire or Huehueteot sculpture was, and the composite sensors. Now, Agustin Ortiz and Luis Barba and team did chemical analyses of this area, and they see that there are signatures that are inconsistent with cooking in this particular area. And so that was interesting to us because we were trying to deduce whether this is domestic space or something else. At least the chemistry signatures suggest that it's not domestic space. We also, in terms of negative evidence, have no burials here, which is what you would expect subfloor burials within residences. And there's very little, almost no grinding tools like manos and metates. So we think all these lines of evidence point to different functions, some ritual functions, some ceremony, public gathering spaces. Now, on the top of Complex 2, we didn't excavate as much. Basically, our goals for excavating more were thwarted by finding so much mural fragments, because then we have to slow the pace of excavations to conserve them and document exactly where they were coming from. And so that happened in both these contexts. But so here you can see it. There's another courtyard group. That one feature with the pots 45 is a post-Teotihuacano one. It's consistent with the Toltec period or Masapan phase. We have mural fragments coming out of this particular room block off the courtyard. You see this nice cut stone with these disc frieze motifs known as chalchihuites. And these, in Aztec times, that was only sort of like palaces or elaborate buildings had these particular friezes on them. Now, I think they were used a little more widely in Teotihuacan, though, but it signals preciousness. This is not a normal building, right? And that's being conveyed visually by different means. Now, the last one of this triad of very large compounds on elevated platforms with talud tablero architecture. Now you have that image of the one from the previous structure, but the ranch hand who works at Tlajinga said that they found one just like that, but it was sculpted. So the sculpted friezes were in this particular building, number 1. We didn't excavate here. What we've done is cleaned off some looting activity just to confirm that yes, there are also stucco and painted structures here, and then did different forms of remote sensing like magnetic gradient, which you see there to show these room blocks in a similar courtyard type illustration. So looking at these spaces in the aggregate and materials associated with them. You can see that there are these imported goods and impressive offerings coming from great distances. Here's one of the few grinding stone implements that we have, but you can see it's sculpted. It's much more elaborate. In fact, it might have not even been used for food production. It could have been for pigment production, some have proposed. We have even imported ceramics like this fine grayware, which maybe was from either Oaxaca or southern Puebla. But really, these murals stand out, and it's worth talking a little bit about them. So we found, in some cases, adhering to the wall, like you can see on the top left there, some remains of murals, but a lot of it had, or almost all of it, had fallen off the stucco, and so we were documenting exactly where it was and trying to refit pieces when we could. We're working with conservators from the Zona Arqueológica de Teotihuacan. So, for instance, here are some of the fragments. You can see scrolls, you can see bird-like images, feathered images. And on the bottom right, there's an image that comes from a mural in front of the Sun Pyramid in an area called Zone 5A. It has these images of birds and butterflies and squirrels and singing or chirping birds. And it is like this image of a Teotihuacano paradise. It's the paradise of birds and butterflies sucking nectar from flowers, a flowery afterworld. Different colleagues have equated this to, similar to the glorious afterlife for warriors who died in battle or women who died in childbirth that we know from the Mexica Aztecs and other groups of the post-classic period. And so we see those motifs in Tlajinga. On the bottom left, that's a illustration of one particular large band scroll from probably the bottom or the by the doorways of these buildings, and it has a mix of the fire motifs like on the bottom that you see on Huehueteot on the fire god's brazier and scroll motifs of water. And so this coupling of water and fire also seems to have some precedent with the later Mexica Aztec and could be a reference to Atlachinoli or this water fire, this sort of sacred generative force associated with war, associated with creation. So what we have here then are murals that would not be out of place in the center of Teotihuacan, but they are 2.5 kilometers from the center of Teotihuacan. They're out on the periphery. So that's telling us something that this even out on the periphery of the site, there were nicer public spaces for neighborhoods like Tlajinga, that there was a social infrastructure of public, more finely made spaces. The other compound has these great motifs. They're not as figurative, like we don't have full birds or anything, but we have these isolated bird eyes, and they're the color green also, and so it could be a quetzal or some other precious tropical bird. We have a smaller sample from here, but again, these are high quality murals that wouldn't have been out of place in the center of the city. So to sum up here with the work in the neighborhood center, we're dealing with elaborate structures over 2 kilometers from the city center. Nevertheless, these offerings talk about very long distance trade and fine rare goods. I mean, actually, the iron ores are very rare in Teotihuacan. You see them earlier in the formative in the Olmec horizon, and then you don't really see them much again in central Mexico. And so it's interesting to see these from Tlajinga. The murals are expressing very high level cosmological themes. The quality, again, wouldn't be out of place in the center of the site. We don't have evidence of these being residential spaces, but they're large compounds, and there could have been elites living in unexcavated portions. We were focused a little more on the courtyard, so elites could have been living somewhere else on these large elevated compounds. And so this talks to us about an urban organization of the city that had nicely distributed public spaces and social infrastructure. And so with Kleinenberg and other urban theorists' model, that's a city that is more integrated, that has public goods and social goods for a larger portion of the population that probably contributed to making Teotihuacan a powerful city and a resilient city for many centuries. So finally, just wrapping up here, I mentioned earlier, that it's really key when working on the periphery of the site that these are areas where modern folks live and they have the same sorts of concerns as the ancient folks who lived here of raising families and having shared occupations and growing their families. And so we've really tried to work with the community as closely as possible and be involved in educational efforts. Here's Daniela Hernandez Sariñana, is a doctoral student at BU, presenting to a class near Tlajinga in San Lorenzo. It's where the schools are located. And then the artist Pedro Coancin Hernandez, who has been drawing elements of daily life at Tlajinga and showing kids his illustration style. So something we're doing now then, this with another artist, Rafael Mena, is working on a zine for distribution among the community, both in paper eventually when we can get back there, and digitally. And so we have a narrative here of kids in Tlajinga. They're the main protagonists, a brother and sister team, and they visit the excavations, they see the archaeology there, and then they travel back in time and see the city in its splendor. And then come back and actually show the archaeologists where to dig next, and they take an active role in driving the archaeology. And this is something we hope to engage local youths with in terms of finding the paths to Teotihuacan fun and worth preserving even out on these urban peripheries. So thank you. I'm very happy to answer any questions you might have, and I will exit out of this here.